Well, hello, class. Today we are going to be reading pages 127 to 130 in the Northern Lights textbook. So let's go ahead and get started.
The New England Schoolteacher. In July 1847, a young woman named Harriet Bishop stepped off the steamboat Argo and onto the landing at the small settlement of St. Paul along the Mississippi River. Several children were there to greet her when she arrived. She had come to be their new teacher, their first schoolteacher. Bishop had grown up in Vermont and had trained to become a teacher, one of the few careers open to women at that time. Teaching jobs were hard for women to find on the East Coast, but an organization called the National Board of Popular Education was looking for women to start schools in newly settled lands to the west. Bishop jumped at the chance. Her assignment was to teach the children of St. Paul, which had no school. St. Paul was hardly even a town in 1847. The buildings were mostly just log huts. The streets were bumpy and muddy. A few hundred people lived there, and most of them were men. Only a dozen or so families with school-aged children lived in the area. About half of the parents had never learned to read. Harriet Bishop knew that teaching children under these circumstances would not be easy, but she seemed to relish the challenge. Here was a field to be cultivated, she later recalled, a garden of untrained flowers to be tended, and the heart raised a thank offering to heaven and cheerfully entered upon its work. More than 150 years later, Harriet Bishop is still remembered for her role in the development of St. Paul.
As we're waiting for this page to load, um, Harriet Bishop did play a real important part in the history of Minnesota, becoming the first school teacher. And we're going to get a chance here now to see what it was actually like um, to teach in St. Paul at this time.
A school for St. Paul. Bishop's new school was an abandoned blacksmith shop. Mud plaster held the log walls together. Small dirty windows let in hardly any sunlight. Rats and snakes lurked in the corners. She got to work. She cleaned up her schoolroom as best she could and decorated the walls with evergreen branches. Bishop seemed to enjoy her new surroundings. Why should I pine for halls of science and literature when such glorious privileges are mine? She wrote. There was not a spot in Earth's broad domain that could have tempted me to an exchange. 3 days after arriving in St. Paul, Bishop opened her little schoolhouse. Her first class had 9 students, though only 2 of them spoke English. The others spoke a variety of languages, including French, Dakota, German, and Ojibwe. One of Bishop's students spoke 3 languages and became her interpreter.
Excuse me, that's pretty crazy to think about, um, trying to teach all those different languages and having to have a student be the interpreter for her. She really, really liked the fact that she was becoming a school teacher here in St. Paul.
Strong feelings. In addition to teaching, Harriet Bishop was involved in her community in many other ways. She established St. Paul's first Sunday school. She helped organize a group whose members believed that drinking alcohol was harmful and should be illegal. She also led several women's organizations that raised money for community projects. Bishop believed that all these efforts would help civilize the people of Minnesota. People traveled far to get to their new home in Minnesota. For many, the journey began in Europe. Getting to the United States involved sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, which could take months. After arriving in New England, travelers used both land and water routes to journey west. To get a sense for how long such trips may have taken, look at the route from Galena to St. Paul. That part alone may have required anywhere from 2 to 6 days.
So here's Galena right here, where my mouse is, to St. Paul. 2 days by steamboat and 6 if you had to go by horse, where they were using stagecoach or a sled in the winter. Stagecoach, and it was turned into a sled.
Harriet Bishop was just one of a growing number of New Englanders, people from the far northeastern states, who were moving to Minnesota. Many of these newcomers had worked in the lumber industry in Maine and New Hampshire, and they were now looking to make their fortunes off the vast timberlands of Wisconsin and Minnesota. Like Bishop, these New Englanders often had strong feelings about American democracy, culture, education, and religion. They had plans for Minnesota's future. Many of these New Englanders became leaders in the towns that were developing along Minnesota's rivers. Because there were so many newcomers from this region of the United States, Minnesota was often called the New England of the West. So what? People are people. When you read about Harriet Bishop, who lived more than 150 years ago, you might think, so what? You might be surprised to learn that people today still have strong feelings about her. Some appreciate the positive things Bishop did to improve the community of St. Paul. Others have a negative opinion of her, because she said hurtful things about the Dakota people who live nearby. Harriet Bishop, like all people, was complicated. Both the positive and the negative reactions to her deeds make sense if we view them from different perspectives. She helped her community. In the 1850s, when St. Paul was just getting started by European American settlers, Bishop was a leader who helped shape this new community. She loved her chosen home and once said, "If Earth has a paradise, it is here." Bishop devoted most of her life to finding ways to make it better. To her, this meant creating opportunities for women. It also meant promoting certain values and beliefs. She participated in at least 8 organizations, including the St. Paul Circle of Industry, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. Many people benefited from Bishop's care and hard work. She said hurtful things about Dakota people. In Chapter 9, you are going to learn about a war. The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 was a painful time in our state's history. It still has an impact on Minnesotans today, and it had a powerful effect on the people who lived through it, including Harriet Bishop. Like most people who see war firsthand, Bishop ended up having very strong feelings about it. In 1863, she wrote a book called Dakota War Whoop, or Indian Massacres and War in Minnesota. In it, she called Dakota soldiers names like Savage, Inhuman Monster, and Heartless Wretch. Bishop's words were influenced by the fear and anger she felt as a result of living in a place that experienced the violence of war. Today, though, some believe words like hers contributed to misunderstandings of what really happened in this war. At the time, people were divided over this issue, and that divide still exists today. People are people. Harriet Bishop did things that affected some people positively and some negatively. In this way, she is like most people, who are more complicated than they might seem. Can you think of a leader today who can be described as both helpful and hurtful?
Well, I'm sure we have a few. All right, last thing we're going to look at here today is the 3 branches of government, and this is where your question for your discussion thread is going to come from, so make sure we're paying close attention to this.
The 3 branches of government. The federal, or national government of the United States has its powers divided among 3 branches. They are called the legislative, executive, and judicial. Each branch has a specific role, and all 3 must work together to keep the government running. When Minnesota became a territory in 1849, 2 of the branches played a role in its establishment. Read on to find out the roles different branches of the federal government played in creating the Minnesota Territory. 3 branches of government. Federal level. The U.S. Capitol. Legislative. Makes laws. Congress. Senate. House of Representatives.
So the first branch of the government is a legislative branch, and that is home to Congress, which is broken up into the Senate and the House of Representatives, and they're the ones who make the laws.
The White House. Executive. Enforces laws. President. Vice President. Cabinet.
The executive branch of the government, that's our president, and he's the one that's in charge of making sure the laws that the legislative branch come up with are enforced. And last we have
the U.S. Supreme Court. Judicial, interprets laws. Supreme Court, other federal courts.
the judicial branch is a branch of government that interprets the laws. They're the ones that you're talking about your judges, and they're the ones who interpret the laws to make decisions on whether somebody is guilty or not. So that concludes our reading for today. Look for the 3 branches of government discussion thread that you should be completing on Schoology. With that being said, have a great day. We will talk to you later. Bye.